So all of this leads into the second thing that we read for this week, which is The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. Charlotte Perkins Stetson. She is remarried later to Gilman. And this is published in 1892, this kind of short story. And so how does it fit into this? I don't know if you guys have read this before. This is something I read in high school. And so maybe it's familiar to you or maybe it's not. But this is a very important early work of American feminist literature that gives a view on mental and physical health of women in the 19th century. So she very much wrote the story to change people's minds about the role of women in society, illustrating how women's lack of autonomy is detrimental to their mental, emotional, and even physical well-being. And that sort of it reflects a lot of her personal experience, and I'm going to show you that as well. But it really kind of outlines how women are treated in the health field in 1892 and sort of how it became sort of detrimental and oppressive to women. And she was a very big supporter of the suffragette movement as well. So we have Gilman writing this story, and I'm going to give you some background about her shortly. But she does become greatly sensationalized by the press after the divorce from her husband and sort of the exposure from this work. So this wasn't a work that was highly accepted at the beginning. People really made fun of her and sort of teased her a lot because of sort of her personal life. So we will talk about that as well. So, the story of the Yellow Wallpaper, if you haven't read it before, is about this woman and her husband John, who go on vacation and take this house for the summer. A colonial mansion, hereditary estate. And it shows sort of very particular themes, and hopefully you sort of start to figure them out and sort of connect them with what we're doing this week in lecture. So the first big theme and idea has to do with marriage and relationships. So, and you probably saw this. This is probably the sort of the most glaring theme of the whole book, or of the short story, I suppose, which is the treatment of John, the husband, against the wife. And you can see that in the quote. So this is kind of a first person story from these journal entries of John's wife. She states, "John laughs at me, of course, but one expects that in a marriage." So Gilman is very much sort of criticizing marriage as an institution, and you can see that throughout in sort of the language she uses. But what you see here is some of these things between John and his wife. You'll see that the female character, who is the main character in the story, does not have a name. What's her name? I don't know. We call her John's wife. But I very much think of her just as Charlotte Perkins Gilman. But you have these quotes that she writes. He loves me very dearly. He says no one but myself could help me out of it, and that I must use my will and self-control and not let any silly fancies run away with me. You have John calling her little girl, blessed little goose. You definitely have that. John has a very demeaning and sort of childish relationship with his wife, very much kind of treats her like an invalid. And you can see it in the way he kind of mocks her and laughs at her and says sort of these particularly hurtful things and demeaning things to her as his wife. The second large theme is obviously women's mental health, like I just stated. And this is really the breakdown of how we understand this story as a whole. And it really reflects this kind of very controversial time for women, which I would say still is a problem today. But you see it in a lot of these quotes, and I listed a bunch here. She says, "I get unreasonably angry with John sometimes. I'm sure I never used to be so sensitive. I think it is due to this nervous condition. But John says if I feel so, I shall neglect proper self-control, so I take pains to control myself, before him at least, and that makes me very tired." He is very careful and loving and hardly lets me stir without special direction. I have a scheduled prescription for each hour in the day. He takes care of me so, and I feel basely ungrateful not to value it more. I'm meant to be such a help to John, such a real rest and comfort, and here I am, a comparative burden already. I cry at nothing, and I cry most of the time. You even have this really kind of crazy moment where John is trying to convince his wife that she feels better, that she looks better, that she's gained weight. And she says, better in body, perhaps. And she starts to kind of drift off. I began and stopped short, for he sat up straight and looked at me with such a stern, reproachful look that I could not say another word. So, although she's sick, although she feels very restless and exhausted, you have this way of John making her feel worse about it, of him coddling her, making her feel like she's not intelligent, while he also has this very strict regimen of health and care to follow. And while she thinks she should get out and visit people, her husband says that it'll be too much for her, and so he won't even allow visitors, and she starts crying even before they finish talking about it. So if you start to get the sense of what's going on here, and maybe you do or don't, a lot of it comes down to this very personal experience that Perkins Gilman had as an individual with Dr. Silas Weird Mitchell. Oh, nailed it, Stephanie. I wrote Weird Mitchell a couple times. I thought that I had caught them all. John says if I don't pick up faster, he shall send me to Weird Mitchell in the fall. So she actually even mentions him once in this short story. But Charlotte Perkins Gilman had, in fact, sought treatment from Dr. Silas Weir Mitchell, who was a very famous doctor at the time. And he was a proponent of the rest cure. So, Perkins Gilman marries Charles Stenson in 1884, and she gives birth to their daughter Catherine, who's here on the left. And she has all these journal entries that show that she was very depressed. She was having a really hard time sort of postpartum. She was newly married and newly had a child and was really having a hard time. She wrote that she had some brain disease, which cannot be felt by anybody else, to the point that her mind has given way. And so Dr. Mitchell advised that she take on the rest cure. So she was not allowed to leave her bed, read, write, sew, talk, or feed herself. Mitchell told her to live as domestic a life as possible, have your child with you all the time, lie down an hour after each meal, have but 2 hours intellectual life a day, and never touch a pen, brush, or pencil as long as you live. And what ended up happening was that she felt even sort of deeper and deeper and deeper into this depression. And she started talking about suicide. And what ended up happening was that her and Simpson decided to get a divorce. And Charlotte and Catherine spent time away, and her depression started to lift, Catherine being her daughter. And she realizes that this sort of depression she was feeling was from restricting herself, from this oppression she felt from this doctor, and this sort of treating her like an invalid. And so Gilman ends up being this sort of prolific writer because she wants to express how she felt, how she was treated. And so, for example, you have this book that she writes called Herland, good Lord. And it is written here in 1915, and she's talking sort of about her kind of life in the fictional sense. So Gilman also questioned why child rearing was done only by women. She felt that Walter Stetson had as much right to raise her child as she did. Gilman fictionalized many of her ideas about family and home in Herland. As you can read this quote, because what she ends up doing after she comes back from spending time away from Catherine, Stetson is remarried already in a very short amount of time. And so Perkins Gilman has Catherine go and live with Stetson and his new wife, which threw sort of the press into a frenzy because they were so shocked that this woman would give up her child. But she believed it was sort of the right move for her daughter at the time. She was dealing with her own mental health issues, and people sort of made fun of her and thought that she was ridiculous. And so it was kind of crazy for her to be sensationalized, not only in the press, but sort of largely in the way that she was treated by people. But what she has stated in the long run in writing these books like The Yellow Wallpaper, she states the real purpose of the story was to reach Dr. S. Weir Mitchell and convince him of the error of his ways. And she does in fact send him a copy in the mail as well for him to read. These are her books as well. And she luckily is able to meet with one of the first female doctors ever, who was a doctor and suffragette, Mary Putnam Jacobi, who is able to actually give her some real treatment. But what we see that is very, very popular in the 1800s is that when the yellow wallpaper is reissued in the 1870s, the rest cure is seen as a symptom of male Victorian medical establishment's desire to reorient females to domestic life. That is, as a cure to pacify active female imaginations at odds with dominant male codes. It was a standard white middle-class process by which a grown woman, under the supervision of a benevolent male expert, was required to turn herself into a helpless, docile, overgrown infant. Which is in reading the rest cure from 2004 that I have on the Moodle. And so you have Dr. Silas Weir Mitchell proposing this ridiculous cure, this rest cure, which is still kind of used today in some ways, which is ironic, but him using all of this sort of documented evidence, and Weir Mitchell is very interesting because all of these people are traveling from like even California to come to Boston because Mitchell had such a huge role in Western medical circles at the time. He healed many soldiers in the Civil War because of the rest cure, because this rest cure helped to for men to gain a lot of weight back and to get healthier. And so he's sort of prescribing it to women. For them to sort of gain their mental health back. And so he has all of these images that you can see, and I've included them in this PowerPoint, where you have sort of the woman before rest cure and after rest cure, that she's able to gain back this weight and to sort of be sort of her happy self again. So many women were coming from all over the country to get this rest cure, believing that it would sort of solve their problems. And unfortunately, even with Gilman sending this work to him, he did not change. He continued to encourage the rest cure, and he was clearly a massive misogynist. He said, most folks think vaguely of home as meaning marriage, husband, wife, children, but for me, its foremost and most beautiful human necessity is a woman, and indeed this is of her finest nobleness, to be homeful for others, and to just by the honest sweetness of her nature, by her charity, and the hospitality of her opinion, such ideas of honor, truth, and friendliness as cluster like porch roses around our best ideas of home. He even spoke out against women's suffrage and women getting places in university and sort of larger education systems. I believe that if the higher education or the college life in any way, body or mind, unfits women to be good wives and mothers, there had better be none of it. And so women should stay in the home, in their place, and his rest cure was part of sort of solving that. And this was not just Mitchell at the time. You have Jean Martin Jarcot, who worked as part of the neurological clinic at the institution of Petit Salpêtrière Hospital. My French again, I'm sorry. Who really became this proponent of this quote unquote idea of hysteria, which is really big in the 1800s to even the 1900s as well, which is insane. But it's considered the first mental disorder attributed sort of purely to women. And it had all these crazy symptoms, such as shortness of breath, anxiety, insomnia, fainting, amnesia, paralysis, pain, spasms, convulsive fits, vomiting, deafness, bizarre movements, seizures, hallucinations, inability to speak. And they also believed that women who chose not to get married were part of this social deviance, which also was kind of a side effect of hysteria. So women were forced into clinics and insane asylums like those run by Charcot, and they were forced to have the rest cure, and sometimes to get hysterectomies. So this crazy way of kind of treating women and mental illness in the 1800s. So this is that clinic where Charcot worked, with sort of a famous hysteric woman, Marie Whitman here. I will tell you that it is really insane to look at the photographic evidence that Charcot and other individuals at this asylum took as sort of proof that hysteria existed. What it really looks like is kind of like women possessed by the devil. And you have like priests enacting like exorcisms. Like it just reminds me of The Exorcist, because here you have these men forcing women to be on this rest cure. They can't leave these spaces. Women with legitimate health concerns, with mental illnesses, all being sort of puddled together in this one asylum, right? And treated sort of all the same way. And so you have this idea of hysteria, and Charcot is going to document hysteria in these photographs. And really, I'm going to tell you that they're awful and they're graphic and they're weird, and they don't really make any sense. And so when you start looking at this, you start to think, well, why is this happening? What is hysteria? Because it sounds like it could be anything. And how are they treating this, right? Like, are these women getting better? What is any of this, right? How do we get to this point in science, in the study of women's bodies, in women's health, that we're sort of grouping all ideas of mental illness for women into one quote unquote category of hysteria? Now, the idea of hysteria is very complicated, and there's a big part of it which comes under the idea of sort of sexual hysteria, which is that until the 20th century, there was a belief that women did not experience sexual desire or pleasure. Sexually frustrated women who often complained about being anxious, sleepy, irritable, nervous, heaviness in lower abdomen, wetness between their legs, etc. And so not only do we see the rest cure and this nonsense that Charcot is producing in asylums with women who are quote unquote crazy, but we have the treatment of women for hysteria being to literally masturbate a woman in a clinic to treat their hysteria. Now, they're called paroxysms because there is no belief that women can experience orgasms. And so they believed, doctors at the time, that they were treating hysteria through this treatment, which was in fact giving women orgasms, which would then clear this anxiety or whatever, this wetness between the legs or whatever you may say. But you have, I don't know if you guys know this, the invention of the vibrator, because there is this doctor who's on the right here, Dr. Joseph Mortimer Granville, who, honest to God, invents the vibrator because his hands are tired from giving women this treatment that he creates an electric vibrator to do the work for him. And this is the invention of the vibrator. No joke. And so what we have happening in the 1800s to the 1900s is that doctors are literally so fatigued by trying to treat all these hysteric women that they invent the vibrator for women. So you can imagine that these women, like Charlotte Perkins Gilman, like suffragettes, are literally not being understood on any level by men, health-wise, physically. And when I say men, I don't mean all men. I mean sort of the institution of men, right? Because I'm sure there are people that are happy and whatever. Who knows? But we have this crazy, crazy, like, idea that women are not sexual beings, but at the same time, we are solving all their problems with orgasms with a vibrator. So these are some lovely advertisements here. You could also use the vibrator on your face to heal headaches. This was a vibrator made in Racine, Wisconsin. No joke. This one is manual. You have to crank it. We have these advertisements coming out, which is insane, and encouraging the massage, as well as the vibrator here. Here are some men using vibrators for other things, like curing the flu and gout. Okay. So, we have this gross misunderstanding of what's going on in women's lives and in women's bodies by men who are meant to treat them, but are instead treating them like second-class citizens who don't have sex lives, who don't have ideas or opinions. They should be in the homes. And so, as John Oliver talks about in this clip I'm going to show you here shortly, as well as this sort of little clip from Molly Grows Up from 1953 about women's sex and sexuality, we have this gross bias in medicine that continues to exist today because of the way that women have been treated through the 19th and 20th centuries in the medical field. I'm going to first show you this little clip from Bias in Medicine, which I've included on the Moodle if you want to watch the whole thing by John Oliver.
Of the National Cancer was utterly ridiculous, as this news report from the 90s shows. In 1990, the Journal of the National Cancer Institute published this report, which looked at the impact of diet on estrogen metabolism and its links to cancer of the breast and uterus. All of the subjects were men.
It's true. They studied a way to prevent cancer of the uterus on people who did not have one. That's ridiculously unhelpful. It's like studying healthy conflict resolution and only surveying the Real Housewives of New York. They've resolved no conflicts. Luann's still pissed off about Dorinda's fish room.
And of course, John Oliver talks about how this is true for race as well, within Black women, not only being women, but being Black women as well.
Misconceptions like those can have tangible effects on treatment. Just think about it. If a quarter of all medical residents think that Black people have thicker skin and nurses have been told that they think suffering is inevitable, that might lead to Black patients' pain being treated differently, which happens. And I actually think that Wanda Sykes summed this up best.
Because of racism, Black people, we don't even get our hands on opioids. They don't even give them to us. White people get opioids like they Tic Tacs. It amazes me how many opioids you motherfuckers have. I had a double mastectomy. You know what they sent my Black ass home with? Ibuprofen.
Okay.
So that's sort of a look at women's health in large, and this is sort of in the 1990s. But here's a little bit of information from the 1950s about how the conversation about women's bodies is going.
And eventually your body will set up its own regular time. Please sit up, Molly.
Oh, Mom, I'm comfortable.
Well, if you sit and stand straight, That'll give the organs inside your body room to function better. And that'll make you feel better.
I'll get it. That's probably Peggy. Hello? Oh, hi, Peggy. Sure, just a minute, I'll ask. Mom, can I go swimming with Peggy tomorrow after school?
I don't think I would, Molly.
But I'd be home by 5:30.
No, it's not a good idea the first 2 or 3 days of your period. You might get chilled and catch cold.
Oh, that's right. Peggy, of course I can't go swimming. You know I've got the curse. That's right. It isn't a good idea the first couple of days. Okay, I'll see you tomorrow.
So that clip was shown on John Oliver as well. But again, sort of the calling your period the curse, of this belief in the 1950s that you can't go swimming, right? Sort of all of this nonsense that's sort of existing. So we have not until 1952 that hysteria is finally dropped as a term in the American Psychiatric Association, and sort of just left in the dust kind of in the way that we discuss women's mental health. But there are all these sort of barriers that women, Black women, white women, all women experience in the health community at large. I put a couple of films in here that kind of talk about a lot of these ideas. So there is a film indeed about the invention of the vibrator, called Hysteria. There's also Kinsley, which features Liam Neeson in the conversation about women and men's sexual health, as well as Masters of Sex. So all of these kind of talking about the inherent biases in this sort of study of female health, right? If you can imagine trying to study the effects of something on a uterus with people don't have uteruses. So what you have happening at the end of the yellow wallpaper, I know coming back around here to the yellow wallpaper, you have her constantly talking about this literal yellow wallpaper. It is stripped off, the paper in great patches all around the head of my bed, about as far as I can reach, and in a great place on the other side of the room, low down. I never saw a worse paper in my life, one of those sprawling flamboyants committing every artistic sin. And she starts to see this paper is something that she needs to solve. The paper looks to me as if it knew what a vicious influence it had. There's a recurrent spot where the pattern lolls, like a broken neck and two bulbous eyes stare at you upside down. I'm getting really fond of the room in spite of the wallpaper, perhaps because of the wallpaper. And what she finds is that she kind of is studying it late at night when she's supposed to be sleeping. And this is something that was in the Rescue article from 2004, in which Weir Mitchell says, she was emotional and ashamed of her tears and honestly hated the whole matter of sickness. You will see such hysterical women. You will see others whose mind are like the back of a piece of needlework with a baffling absence of pattern. And then the sort of other side with Charlotte Perkins Gilman, I will follow the pointless pattern to some sort of conclusion. And again, John continuing to make fun of her, not taking her seriously. She laughs at him, and then she begins to be afraid of John, as is the woman behind the paper. Jane is finding stains of yellow on John's clothes, and she is getting suspicious of John. I don't like the look in his eyes, and pretending to be very loving and kind, as if I couldn't see through him, as if she's almost starting to figure out what's going on in her life. And then at the end, which is that it was always the same shape, only very numerous, and it is like a woman stooping down and creeping about behind the pattern. The front pattern does move, and no wonder, the woman behind shakes it. She crawls around fast, and her crawling shakes it all over. She just takes hold of the bars and shakes them hard. As it was moonlight and the poor thing began to crawl and shake the pattern, I got up and ran to help her. I pulled, and she shook, and I shook, and she pulled, and before morning we had peeled off yards of that paper. I don't like to look out the windows even. There are so many of those creepy women, and they creep so fast. I wonder if they all come out of the wallpaper as I did. I suppose I shall have to get back behind that pattern when it comes night, and that is hard. But here I can creep smoothly on the floor, and my shoulder just fits in that long smooch around the wall, so I cannot lose my way. I've got out at last, said I, in spite of you and Jane, and I've pulled off most of the paper so you can't put me back. Now why should that man have fainted? But he did, and right across my path, by the wall, so that I had to creep over him every time. So, what you have happening, if you didn't sort of follow, is that her sort of seeing this kind of symbolic self, right? Creeping behind the paper, pretending to be okay with what's going on in her life. And then she sort of joins in and liberates herself from this paper, refusing to be put back. And sort of scares the crap out of her husband to some capacity. So what we have here is that Gillman is protesting the patriarchal society that has silenced female voices and controlled them based on what is best for them, with no life outside the home, and mentally weak and fragile. But she wrote this not to drive people to be crazy, but to stop people from being driven crazy. So what we have here is that Gillman is reflecting back on what happened to her and sort of telling her story so that these other women who might feel this way, might be forced into this rest cure, might see sort of this other life that they could have.